Hello and welcome to another video. Today, I'll be taking you through the process of making some 1880s undies, a chemise, split drawers, and most importantly, a corset. For this project, my theme is venomous, and for these layers I took inspiration from the Black Widow spider. So let's begin. For the corset, I adapted a pattern from Jill Salen's book, based on this extant mid-1880s piece. The novel feature at the waist immediately reminded me of the pattern on some Black Widow species' abdomens, so I knew that this would be the perfect base pattern for me. I scanned, then printed the pattern to scale, and made my first changes on paper. First, I added the seam allowances, which I always do by fastening two pens together with their points at the desired distance, then tracing around the outside of the pattern. Then I used a sort of a slash and spread method to add some extra room, starting with a bit more than I knew I'd need. Using this pattern, I made my first mock-up with a thrifted bedsheet. I didn't worry about exactness or neatness at this stage, as it was only the first iteration. From this, I added a few inches to the top edge to prevent spillage, and sized down necessary pieces to reduce circumference. For mock-up number 2, I used a thick cotton canvas to better approximate the volume of the finished piece, and took the time to add some boning channels. Additionally, I sewed the center front seam shut so I could better approximate the finished fit. With the garment on, I made a few fitting tweaks, then transferred my changes to paper and moved on. Lining time. Using my adapted pattern, I cut out all pieces except the waistband over 2 layers of this super soft and lovely cotton. With everything cut out, I could seam the lining. This wasn't hard, though I did have to be careful as the seams weren't fully trued. Essentially, all I did was join the pieces together in pairs, then attach pairs to one another, clipping and pressing seams as I went. This left me with 2 mirrored linings, one for the left side and one for the right. At this point, I retrieved my second mock-up to use as a stiff interlining. I have no idea if this is historically compliant, but it is effective, doesn't waste fabric, and the final product has the right look, so it works for me. I first pinned the lining to the interlining, wrong sides together. In order to make sure that everything lined up properly, I used the seams as a guide as I pinned across the top and bottom edges. This I secured with machine top stitching. Then I wrapped the lining's seam allowances around to the right side of the interlining, both at the center front and the center back openings. Since this would later be covered by taffeta, I didn't bother finishing except by folding the raw edge and top stitching. Taffeta next. I cut 2 of each piece, again except the waistband, from this red silk taffeta, which is left over from my 1830s day dress, which you can check out in the link above. For each, I added a bit of extra room across the top and bottom edge just for a bit of metaphorical breathing room. This really threw off the truing of the seams, but given that I knew quite well how it went together at this point, I wasn't concerned. For my own peace of mind, I stay-stitched within the seam allowance at the center back opening, knowing that these pieces would take a bit of wear and tear during construction. Luckily, I didn't have to do this for the front pieces, as I'd been careful to cut those along the selvage. Seaming the taffeta was the same process as the lining. I joined the pieces in pairs, easing, clipping, and pressing as necessary. Again, I was left with 2 mirrored pieces, one for the left and one for the right. This is what these pieces looked like, pinned atop the rest of the corset. Next, I cut out 2 waistbands, which, as you can see, I modified heavily to fit my adjusted pattern. On the original garment, I believe that the waistband is a structural element, but for my purposes it is merely decorative, and thus I stitched it atop the red taffeta. For this, I used silk taffeta once more, but in black. I thought this would help create negative space and emphasize the red hourglass shape. Here, you can see that its effect as I pinned the taffeta over the interlining and made a final few adjustments to their shape. The next order of business was to attach the taffeta to the interlining. This I did by basting the taffeta to this interlining, wrong side to right side, while everything was on my dress form. Then, once my project was back on the table, I could fold the taffeta over the center front and back edges, tucking the raw edge under and top stitching it in place through all layers, 1/4 of an inch away from the center back. This created the first boning channels too. I made a second 1/4 inch set at the back by top stitching through all the layers, but the rest were 3/8 of an inch for ease of slipping in the bones. Making the boning channels was just quite a bit of top stitching. First, I made a line of top stitches just ever so slightly to the outside of each seam, subsequently running a secondary line of top stitches 3/8 of an inch from the first to create the boning channel. Each seam except those directly next to the bust got a channel, and I inserted 1/4 inch flat steel bones into each one. Back to the waistbands. First, I folded the top and bottom edges inward toward the wrong side, clipping as needed, and machine top stitched these down. Then I laid these pieces atop the corset, matching both sides as I went. I turned the side edges inwards and pinned them to the corset, using the seams on the corset as a guideline. Next, I machine top stitched through all layers only along these side edges. The top and bottom edges I secured by hand, curling the corset over my non-dominant hand as I worked to ensure that the waistband would take the curve that the whole garment would have over my body. At this stage, the garment really started to look like a corset. Binding was the next order of business in order to encase the remaining raw edges. I made my binding from the same black silk taffeta as the waistband and cut along the cross grain and not the bias, as I wanted to save on fabric and didn't need the binding to stretch all that much. As I wanted 1/4 inch binding, I cut the strips 1 inch wide and folded and pressed the raw edges inwards twice. Then I could sandwich the corset's top and bottom edges within the binding and machine top stitch everything in place. Compared to 18th century binding, this is a cinch. I also put in the busk, but I deleted the footage by accident. Sorry. Here's what it looks like though. Grommets next. Well, you can see I've done some cording, but we'll get there in a moment. As we're late in the century, these can be metal and not hand-worked. Hooray! First, I marked out their placement, matching both sides evenly. To set each one in, I cut a small X through all layers, just big enough to fit the grommet. Then I slid the grommet in one side, placing the washer over top on the other. Using a tool, die, and mallet, I hammered everything in place. Satisfying. Now I really ought to show you how I did the cording, which I added to give structure to the bust and hip. If you're interested in a more detailed cording tutorial, you can check out my video on my 1830s stays, linked above. But the process I like to use is pretty simple anyway. By machine, I top stitched in cording channels through all 3 corset layers. Then I flipped the corset over and made a small hole in the lining on either end of the channel. Using a large needle, I guided the cording through each channel by hand. This can require quite a bit of force, so I used my trusty multi-tool as needed. Time for the decorative touches. One of these is flossing. Extant garments of this era seem to be almost always flossed, the purpose of which is to stabilize the bones while at the same time providing a bit of decoration. I opted for some simple flossing. First, I did this sort of crisscross pattern at the base of each boning channel, except for the ones on either side of the grommets, to hold the bottom of each bone in place. This is the guideline I used, and I've linked it in the description box. Off camera, I added a few more simple embellishments. Last step. With all this done, I could attach this lovely black lace along the top edge by hand, simply hiding my stitches within the lace's pattern. And with that, the corset was done. Next up, a chemise and some very attractive split drawers, which as you can see I raged about on Twitter. For both, I used a very light cotton voile, cotton voile, I just hate pronouncing it like that, so it'd be as soft and breathable as possible. The most undies of this period were white or off-white. I went full gothic and used black. I patterned both the chemise and the drawers myself, using a historical manual as a guide. While this manual was published in 1909, its cutting guidelines for chemise and drawers were similar enough to the 1880s that I could make simple modifications for my time period and my measurements, and have it work perfectly. I didn't bother with a mock-up, as the pattern is very simple. It's just 2 pieces with the neckline lower in the front and gathered both in the front and the back. Here, you can see me using chalk to pattern the front piece over the fold to create a symmetrical front. For the back, I simply laid this piece atop the voile, and cut a second piece, identical to the first except with an addition of a few inches height at the neckline. Assembly was a cinch. First, I rolled and top stitched what would become hems and arm openings of both front and back pieces. The great thing about this time period is that visible machine stitching isn't just okay, it's actually historically accurate. Huzzah, huzzah! Then I could join back to front. The first part of this was to seam the shoulders. After sewing and pressing a standard seam, I trimmed one side of the seam allowance and folded the other side over it, pinning it in place. Then I ran a second line of stitches along this folded portion. While this doesn't fully enclose all raw edges as a truly historically accurate seam might, it does greatly reduce the chance of fraying, not to mention that it looks perfectly lovely from the outside. For the side seams I did much the same, though I used a smaller seam allowance purely for my own convenience. Next, I created a placket at the front. To do so, I first cut a slit from the center of the neckline to my desired length. Then I made my binding from the same voile, and sandwiched the raw edges between the folds of the pressed binding. Again, I secured this with machine top stitching. For the bottom of the placket, I used some leftover embroidery floss to make bar tacks for extra strength and, I think, for a bit of subtle flair. I also bound the neckline. Again, I used matching binding, but attached it slightly differently this time. First, I cut my binding to the length of my desired neckline circumference. Then I marked on both the chemise and the binding the points between which I would gather. Subsequently, I matched these points together and pinned the binding to the chemise, right sides together. After gathering the chemise into the binding, I stitched all the way around with my machine using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I could fold the binding over the raw edge, pin, and top stitch in place. Finishing touches now. I pinned, then machine top stitched lace around the neckline, armholes, and hem. Then I threaded a red ribbon through the purpose-made gaps in the lace, which I think added a nice pop of color. Finally, I added a closure. First was this pearly button. Then I worked a buttonhole by hand, cutting open a slit and using a buttonhole stitch to finish the raw edge. Time now for these split drawers, which are absolutely ridiculous, which is why I opted for a chemise to hide them instead of making combinations that would show them off. Using the same historical guide I'd used for the chemise, I cut 2 matching leg pieces, adjusting the proportions to fit my measurements. Next, I had to construct. The trick for joining these was to remember that these drawers actually remain open at the crotch, unlike modern garments, which is why we call these split. This meant I seamed the inner thighs in a portion between the waistband and the crotch, and left the rest open. The open part at the center, front, and back I rolled and machine top stitched to enclose the raw edge. In order to finish them, I bound the leg openings with the same method I'd used on the chemise's placket. Since I wanted a drawstring at the waist instead of a button, I made a thin waistband to accommodate a slip of black ribbon that I could tie to my desired length. Finally, I added lace and ribbon to the cuffs, and these ridiculous knickers were done. With that, my Black Widow underwear was complete. I had such fun making these pieces, even the drawers, as silly as they are, and very much enjoyed making my own patterns from historical references. Next up, I'll be creating a mid-1880s day dress to go over this, and I assure you it will be as equally venomous as the Black Widow. Until then, thank you for joining me. Please feel free to check out my other videos or to follow me on socials. Drop me a like or a comment, and you can even subscribe. Thanks, take care, and I'll see you next time.